This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. We're continuing our study of logical fallacies by looking this week at episode 339, entitled Avoiding the No True Scotsman Fallacy. We've been working through the most common logical fallacies that get committed, the worst offenders, and the goal, of course, is to help us to understand what these fallacies are, why they are problematic, when people actually use them in their debates and discussions about the Trinity and the deity of Christ and the identity of God and the identity of Jesus, and hopefully we can better understand them so that we can stop using them ourselves. So, as I mentioned, this week's episode is going to examine the No True Scotsman fallacy. And the No True Scotsman occurs when somebody dismisses a counterexample to a general claim by asserting that the counterexample is not a true representative of the group in question. And we'll go through several details to make sure that we are clear on how this actually works. So, what are the common ways that the No True Scotsman fallacy is committed in 2024? How can we identify when we or others commit this fallacy? Why is this fallacy unhelpful in our debates concerning God and Jesus Christ? And how should we discuss theology with others without falling prey to the fallacy of the No True Scotsman? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the No True Scotsman fallacy. So again, the No True Scotsman fallacy occurs when somebody responds to a counterexample to a general claim by redefining the criteria in order to exclude the counterexample that was given, rather than addressing the counterexample in its validity. This particular fallacy involves changing the definition of a category or group in order to dismiss legitimate exceptions that are put forward. Thereby, the original claim is protected from any sort of criticism without engaging any actual evidence. So, it starts off with a generalization, like a broad claim is made about a group or a person or a category or a topic, and then the debate opponent is going to bring forth a counterexample. They're going to supply some evidence. They're going to present a counterexample that is going to contradict the generalization. And the counterexample is legitimate evidence. So the first person is going to commit the No True Scotsman fallacy by redefining the initial term. They'll say that the criteria for membership in this group has now changed to exclude the counterexample that was given, and yet they don't justify this change. They don't explain why that counterexample doesn't actually work. And in doing so, they are avoiding the actual evidence. Instead of addressing the counterexample, the response avoids engaging with the challenge by changing the definition. So here are some examples in our modern culture, and we'll look at these examples before we move to some of the biblical examples. So let's talk about political allegiance. Someone might make the claim that no true member of our political party would support a policy of an open border. And then someone could bring a counterexample and say, well, this particular party member does support an open border. And then the response is going to commit the no true Scotsman fallacy by saying, well, no true political party member would support that particular policy. So what they've done is they've redefined the term in order to exclude the legitimate counterexample. Another one would look at cultural identity. So someone could make the claim about loyalty to a particular music genre by saying that no true fan of alternative rock listens to Nickelback. And a counterexample could be offered, and that person could say, well, I'm a true fan of alternative rock, and I love Nickelback. And then the response, by committing the fallacy, would say, well, no true fan listens to Nickelback. And thereby they've redefined their original terms in order to exclude this legitimate counterexample. Here's another example with the loyalty that people have to their particular sports team. Okay, so someone could say that no true fan of our team would ever criticize the head coach. And then you'll have the counterexample of a particularly dedicated fan who does, in fact, criticize the coach. But instead of accepting that legitimate counterexample, the no true Scotsman fallacy is committed, and the first person is going to say, well, no true fan of our team would ever criticize the coach. And thereby they have excluded the legitimate counterexample. What about people with their choices of the food that they eat? So someone might make the claim that no true steak eater would ever order their steak well done. And then someone is going to offer the counterexample, and they'll say, well, this particular steak eater orders his steak well done. And then in order to commit the fallacy, the original person is going to say, well, no true steak eater would ever even consider eating a steak well done. What about activism? So someone could say that, well, no true activist would drink from a paper straw. And then a counterexample will be offered. Well, some activists drink from paper straws when no one else is looking. And then the response, in order to exclude this legitimate counterexample, would say, well, no true activist would ever even consider drinking from a straw made out of paper. So, why is the no true Scotsman fallacy fallacious? Well, clearly there's circular reasoning that is taking place. The argument inevitably becomes circular because it defines the term or the group in a way that is automatically going to support that particular claim. It fails to engage with legitimate evidence or exceptions or counterexamples that are authentically brought forth. It avoids meaningful discussion with clear facts that are brought forth that actually make the original claim look not as strong as the debate person might consider. And it creates a situation in which the claims made by the first person are unfalsifiable. Since they're changing the definition in order to exclude evidence, the claim just becomes something that is unfalsifiable. No counterexample is ever going to be able to change their mind, and they're just going to dismiss all evidence that contradicts what they're saying. That's the problem with the no true Scotsman fallacy. Now, that's all fine and dandy with common examples, but how does this fallacy get committed in debates and discussions about the deity of Christ and about the Trinity and about definitions of God and Jesus? That's what people are interested in, and we need to talk about that. So let's move to our second point, point number 2, common no true Scotsman fallacies in Christological debates. So, in the context of Trinitarian theology and discussions about the identity of God, the no true Scotsman fallacy is often committed in order to define Christian belief or true Christian identity. That's where this issue shows up most frequently. Here are some examples of the most egregious repeat offenders. So let's look at the topic of denominational purity. So a Trinitarian might claim that no true Christian denies the doctrine of the Trinity. But when someone offers legitimate examples of self-identified Christians who don't adhere to the doctrine of the Trinity, like Unitarians or Arians, the response might be, if they're going to commit this particular fallacy, well, those persons are not true Christians. And what they've done is they've dismissed the legitimate counterexamples. These people claim to be Christians, and they're redefining the criteria of what it actually means to be a true Christian, thereby committing the no True Scotsman fallacy. That's the first example. The second example is looking at historical figures in church history. So a Trinitarian might assert that all of the great early church fathers and early Christian theologians believed and taught the doctrine of the Trinity. And then someone could quite easily point out several early Christian thinkers or apologists or influential early believers that possessed non-Trinitarian views. But the response would be, by committing this fallacy, that, well, those theologians, they weren't true representatives of Christian theology. They were not great early Christian theologians, and thereby they've redefined the term in order to exclude the legitimate counterexample. Number 3, ecumenical councils. So a Trinitarian might argue that all of the early Christian church councils affirm the doctrine of the Trinity. But then when you remind them that the Council of Nicaea in 325 not only had the Trinity completely absent from it, but it had significant Arian opposition, then the response is going to be, for those that want to commit the fallacy, that, well, those dissenters, they weren't really Christian, and the Council of Nicaea eventually evolved into the doctrine of the Trinity anyway, so there they have it. They have avoided the legitimate rebuttal in order to maintain their particular claim, and they just say that anyone who opposed the Trinity, they're not really Christian. Number 4, the identity of biblical scholars. So a Trinitarian might argue that all biblical scholars believe in the deity of Christ. And then I could point out that, in fact, most biblical scholars don't make this claim in their commentaries. But the response typically is that, well, those scholars, they're liberal, they're unbelieving, they're not real Christians, and because of these faults, they are not really biblical scholars. And they've committed the no True Scotsman fallacy. They have redefined their own terms with their circular reasoning in order to avoid the uncomfortable truth. Number 5, scriptural interpretation. Someone might claim that no true interpretation of the entire Bible would deny that Christ is divine. And someone might offer a legitimate counterexample that many scholars throughout the last 2,000 years have interpreted these passages in different ways, in ways in particular that do not draw the conclusion that Jesus is inherently divine. But then the no True Scotsman fallacy is committed, and the original person responds by saying, well, no true interpretation would conclude what you just said. Only true interpretations of the entire Bible would automatically affirm that Jesus is divine. So in each case, you can see that the fallacy lies in the dismissal of the legitimate counterexample that's offered, and in doing so, they redefine the original term as being a true member of this group, rather than actually addressing the legitimacy of the counterexample that has been offered. The rebuttal has been offered. It's a legitimate rebuttal that shows that the original claim is not true and it's in need of further revision. And instead of the first person accepting that, they ignore the counterexample and they start their circular reasoning and they exclude all evidence that makes their claim look illegitimate. So, those are the examples. How can we avoid committing the True Scotsman fallacy? How can we apply this principle to our life and avoid making a fool of ourselves? This will be our third and final point for this week's episode. So here are 5 tips in order to keep you from falling prey of committing the no true Scotsman fallacy. Number 1, you need to define the criteria clearly. Make sure that you are setting clear definitions, and this involves establishing consistent and clear criteria for group membership or characteristics. You don't want to be vague. Ensure that your definitions are specific and inclusive of genuine diversity within that particular group. If there is a diversity among Christianity in the 2nd century, you need to acknowledge that. Number 2, acknowledge diversity within the particular definition of a particular term. We should recognize that there's variation and accept that there are groups of people with different beliefs that also have different views and different interpretations and different behaviors. And there are exceptions that occur, and we should accept them, we should embrace them, and understand that the exceptions don't necessarily invalidate a general claim, but it may indicate that the topic is a little bit more complex than we might have initially led others to believe, and we need to go back and revise the initial claim in order to acknowledge that complexity. Number 3, we need to openly and willingly engage with the counterexamples. We need to consider the evidence that's brought forth with the counterexamples. And in doing so, we evaluate those counterexamples on the merits of their truthfulness, and we need to consider the implications. It's possible that we are wrong, and others are coming alongside in order to show us something that we have overlooked. And so we need to be open to hearing that gentle correction. We have to be willing to adjust our claims and be open to modifying or redefining our terms if a legitimate counterexample is brought forth in a way that provides a valid challenge to what we previously thought was actually true. This keeps us honest, it keeps us humble, and it keeps us transparent. Number 4, we need to use consistent standards. Make sure that you are applying a uniform set of criteria. Use the very same criteria for all members of a particular group without altering them in order to suit your own particular argument. If you're going to say that all early Christians believed X, then you better make sure that that fits 100% of the data that is available. And by using consistent standards, you can help yourself to avoid your own bias. We've talked about this before. Everybody has a bias. They need to acknowledge that they have it, and they need to consider that particular bias when they are creating standards that are consistent. Make sure that you ensure that your criteria is not being selectively applied in order to exclude examples that are inconvenient for your position. Because if you do this, your opponent is going to see it, and they're going to point it out, and it's going to make you look foolish. You don't want to look foolish. You want to be a good, responsible, honest, and respectable dialogue partner. And number 5, we need to encourage that dialogue. We need to be open to discussion, especially with people that have different views, because they may have something that we have not considered. They may have some truth that they can teach us. They may have a perspective that we need to incorporate into our own views. Be willing to engage in open discussion that allows for different perspectives to be discussed, and be open to constructive criticism of your own perspective. And in doing so, you can seek to have a better understanding of the particular topic that you're discussing or that you're debating. You want to make it your aim to understand why counterexamples exist, why other people are convinced based on those counterexamples of their positions, and try to understand what those counterexamples reveal about the particular group that you are trying to describe. So by following these 5 easy steps, you too can ensure that your arguments will remain fair, they'll remain logically consistent, and they will be open to meaningful engagement with the evidence and differing viewpoints without resolving to circular reasoning and failing to admit when good counterexamples are brought forth to our attention. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we examine another common logical fallacy, which is the anecdotal fallacy. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support our podcast absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube and iTunes, by giving us an honest review on iTunes, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you'd like to offer a financial donation, please check out the episode description for a link to PayPal. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.